The tablecloth at my parents' retirement dinner was white linen, ironed flat, without a single crease. Mom had spent 3 days getting the details right. The centerpieces, the seating chart, the little printed menus with gold borders. She always said presentation was everything. I used to think she meant the dinner parties. It took me a long time to realize she meant us, her daughters. Claire was the presentation. I was the footnote. I arrived at the function room at the Otautahi Club 15 minutes early, which is what I always did when I wanted to feel less invisible, get there before the crowd, claim a spot, exist in the room before anyone could decide I didn't belong in it. My younger sister, Claire, arrived 20 minutes late, which is what she always did when she wanted to make sure everyone noticed her entrance. It worked, as it always did. The room turned, conversations paused. Our father actually crossed the floor to meet her at the door, his face open and warm in a way I hadn't seen him direct at me since I was probably 9 years old. I was 26, Claire was 23. Our parents, Richard and Margaret Holloway, were retiring from the family landscaping business Holloway Grounds after 31 years. Dad had built it from a one-man operation out of the back of a ute in Christchurch into a legitimate commercial landscaping company with contracts across Canterbury and into the Waikato. It wasn't a corporation. It wasn't glamorous, but it was solid, and it was theirs. And growing up, I had understood without anyone ever telling me directly that it was also, in some way, supposed to be ours. I had worked in that business since I was 16. Not pocket money work, real work. School holidays spent on job sites, learning to read soil drainage reports, understanding why certain native plantings failed in certain microclimates. When I finished my business degree at Canterbury, I came straight back and started running the accounts. Dad gave me the operations manager title when I was 24. I took it seriously. I restructured the invoicing system, brought 3 new council contracts in within 8 months, and quietly fixed a payroll issue that had been leaking money for 2 years without anyone noticing. Claire had studied fashion in Wellington, come home for 6 months, decided Christchurch was boring, and moved to Auckland to work for a PR firm that represented beauty brands. She was good at her job, by all accounts. She was also very far away from anything to do with the landscaping business. I tell you all of this not to make myself sound impressive, and not to make Claire sound like a villain she isn't one, not really. I tell you this because context matters. Because what happened at that dinner table made no sense without it. And because for a long time I wondered if I had imagined the way things were, if my sense of my own contributions had been inflated by some need to feel worthy. The events of the following week proved to me, clearly and legally, and without any room for interpretation, that I had not imagined anything at all. Dinner was a set menu. Entree, main, dessert. My father's oldest friends were there, some of the long-term staff, a few of the commercial clients he'd built relationships with over the decades. Our mum moved through the room the way she always did at these things, gracious, attentive, slightly performative. She had spent 31 years being the face of Holloway Grounds at every client dinner and industry event, and she wore that role like a second skin. I sat next to our dad's operations foreman, a man named Gareth, who had been with the company for 19 years. We talked about the Selwyn district job, about the new planting mix they'd trialed down south, about nothing important. I was comfortable. I was calm. I had no idea what was coming. When the dessert plates were cleared, my father stood up. He tapped his wine glass with a fork, which was a thing he did at every significant occasion, and the room settled into the attentive silence that always followed the sound. He was good at commanding a room, my father. Not loud, he never needed to be loud. He simply had a weight to him, a steadiness that made people want to hear what he was going to say. He talked about 31 years. He talked about Mum, which made her cry in the contained way she always cried, dabbing at the corner of one eye with a napkin while smiling. He talked about the business and what it had meant to build something from nothing, and how proud he was of what Holloway Grounds had become. And then he said he wanted to announce the future. "Claire," he said, looking directly at my sister, who was seated 2 spots to his left with her champagne glass and her perfect blowout. "Your mother and I have decided that Holloway Grounds will be transferred to you. We want to keep it in the family, and we know you'll bring a fresh energy to it." The room made a collective warm sound. People clapped. Someone said, "Wonderful." Gareth, beside me, started clapping too. then seemed to remember I was there, and glanced at me with an expression I chose not to examine too closely. Claire looked genuinely surprised, which I believed was real. I don't think she had known this was coming either. She put her hands over her mouth, then stood up and hugged my father, and then my mother, and the whole room watched this moment of family warmth with the approving attention of people who have had 2 wines and want to feel good about something. I sat very still. I didn't cry. I didn't make a scene. I picked up my water glass and I took a slow sip, and I looked at the white linen tablecloth, and I thought about a specific piece of paperwork I had signed 14 months ago, sitting in a lawyer's office in the CBD with a very careful woman named Priya, who had explained every clause to me twice before I put my name on anything. I thought, they don't know. And then I thought, that's going to be a very interesting conversation. After dinner, my father found me near the coat rack while people were getting their jackets. He had the look he always had when he wanted to manage my feelings about something slightly careful, slightly paternal, slightly dismissive in the way that people are when they've already decided the outcome and are now just hoping you'll make it easy for them. You understand this is about what's best for the business, he said. Of course, I said. Claire has the personality for it. The people skills. You know how important that is. You'll always have a place there, obviously. We're not pushing you out. I looked at him. He was 61 years old, silver-haired, the kind of man who had always been competent and certain, and who had built those qualities into armor so thick he sometimes couldn't hear what was right in front of him. I know, I said. Drive safe tonight. He looked slightly unsatisfied by that response, as though he'd prepared for either tears or anger, and my calm had broken something in his script. He squeezed my shoulder once and went to say goodbye to his guests. I drove home and sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea and the silence of my own flat, which I had rented for 2 years in Addington, and which I loved precisely because nothing in it was contingent on anyone else's approval. I didn't call anyone. I didn't send messages. I just sat there and thought, with something that wasn't quite satisfaction and wasn't quite sadness. It was more like the feeling you get just before a complicated thing becomes simple. Let me go back 14 months, because that's where this story actually starts. Holloway Grounds had been struggling in ways that my father hadn't wanted to fully acknowledge. Not critically, the business was still operating, still making money, but the commercial landscaping sector had tightened. 2 of our bigger ongoing maintenance contracts had gone to tender, and we'd lost them on price. And Dad had started talking about retirement in a way that felt less like planning and more like wanting out. The business needed reinvestment, restructuring, a new direction. Dad was tired. In that context, he had gone to a business broker. Not to sell, he told me, just to understand the options, to get a valuation. The broker's number had come back at $1.4 million for the business, as a going concern, including the equipment, the vehicles, the client contracts, the brand. Dad had told me this over coffee one morning in the office. He'd said the number almost dismissively, as if he'd expected more, or as if the act of naming it had made it feel smaller than he'd hoped. That's a solid valuation, I said. It's fine, he said. What he didn't tell me, but what I found out 3 weeks later from the company accountant, who was under the impression I already knew, was that my father had accepted an expression of interest from a buyer. Not a full offer, not a signed contract, but a serious conversation with a commercial entity that had been quietly acquiring small landscaping and grounds maintenance businesses across the South Island. The acquiring entity was called Meridian Property Services Limited. I knew that name. I had registered it. This requires some explanation, and I want to be clear about the sequence of events, because the sequence matters. 18 months before my parents' retirement dinner, I had begun talking to a business mentor through a Canterbury Regional Chamber of Commerce program, a woman named Diane, who had spent 20 years building and selling trade businesses and who had a very clear-eyed view of how family business succession usually went wrong. She was the one who said to me, gently but directly, that I should consider what my position in Holloway Grounds actually was. Legally and structurally, separate from what I had been led to believe it was emotionally. I did not own any shares. I had never been offered shares. I was an employee with a job title, a salary, and the distinct impression that my work and loyalty would eventually be rewarded in ways that were never written down anywhere. That's not equity, Diane said. That's hope. She wasn't unkind about it. She was just accurate. Over the following 6 months, with Diane's guidance and the help of a commercial lawyer, I set up Meridian Property Services Limited as a holding company. I did this with money I had saved over 4 years of working. I had always been careful with money, had lived well below my means, had an investment portfolio my parents didn't know the size of, because I had never seen any reason to make it their business. The company I set up was legitimate, properly registered, clean. When I heard through the accountant that Holloway Grounds was in early conversations with a potential buyer, and when the broker reached out to what turned out to be my company with a detailed information memorandum about the business I had been running for 2 years, I made a decision. I engaged Priya. The process took 11 weeks. It was careful, thorough, and completely at arm's length. Meridian Property Services was represented by Priya's firm, Holloway Grounds, was represented by a different firm my father had used for years, and nothing in the transaction documents connected me by name to the acquiring entity. This wasn't deception, it was structure. Priya had been very clear with me that there was nothing improper about any of it. A buyer is not obligated to disclose their identity in a commercial sale negotiation. The vendor is responsible for conducting their own due diligence on who they're selling to. My father's legal team, apparently, had not done a great deal of that. The sale completed. $1.38 million, slightly below the original valuation, because of 2 outstanding equipment finance agreements I had identified in the documents. I used a mix of savings and a business acquisition loan that I had secured at a good rate because my personal financial position was, thanks to 4 years of careful living, considerably stronger than my salary might have suggested. Holloway Grounds, the brand, the contracts, the vehicles, the client relationships I had personally built, the processes I had personally designed, was now owned by Meridian Property Services Limited, which was owned by me. My father had signed the papers. His lawyer had signed the papers. The broker had collected a fee. Everyone had been very pleased with the outcome. And then, 14 months later, at a white linen dinner in the Otautahi Club, my father had stood up and told a room full of people that he was giving the business to my sister. I had sat quietly and thought, he doesn't know he already sold it. On the Monday after the dinner, I went to the office as usual. I was, after all, still the operations manager, and Meridian Property Services, my company, the actual legal owner of Holloway Grounds, had agreed at the time of acquisition to retain existing management and staff on their current terms during a transition period. I had structured it that way deliberately. My father arrived at 9, which was late for him. He looked slightly tired and slightly pleased with himself, the way he always looked after a successful event. "Good dinner," he said. "It was," I said. "Claire's flying down on Wednesday. Thought we'd start showing her around, getting her across the operations." "Okay," I said. He paused in the doorway of my office. "You're really all right with this?" It was more statement than question, and I could hear the mild discomfort beneath it. Not guilt exactly, more the unease of a man who had made a decision he knew was unfair and wanted to be reassured that he'd gotten away with it. "I think," I said carefully, "that there are some things you should probably look at before Wednesday." "What things?" I opened the top drawer of my desk and took out a folder. Inside, it was a copy of the sale and purchase agreement, the transfer of ownership documentation, the company registration for Meridian Property Services, and a single clean summary page that Priya had prepared at my request, which laid out the ownership structure in plain language. I slid it across the desk. He picked it up. He read the first page. I watched his face. There is something particular about watching a very confident person understand that they have made a significant error. The confidence doesn't disappear all at once. It sort of folds inward, layer by layer. As the information arrives in a sequence the brain is trying to resist. His eyebrows drew together. He went back to the top of the page. He read it again. "What is this?" he said, and it wasn't quite a question. "That's the sale documentation," I said. "From 14 months ago. Meridian Property is mine," I said. "Has been mine since registration. You sold Holloway Grounds to my company." The silence was very thorough. "That's not." He stopped. Started again. "Your name isn't on this. The company's name is on it. I own the company. He sat down in the chair across from my desk, which was something I had never seen him do before, just sit, without having decided to, without control over the movement. He looked at the papers, and then he looked at me, and for a moment, he looked genuinely old, in a way that made something complicated move through my chest, something that wasn't triumph and wasn't sympathy, but existed somewhere in between. You bought your own family's business, he said, without telling us. You sold your own family member's work, I said quietly, without telling her. He didn't have an answer for that. He left the office at midday. He came back at 3 with my mother, who had clearly been crying, and their long-standing family solicitor, a man named Jeffrey, who was in his late 60s, and who I had met at Christmas dinners for most of my life. Jeffrey reviewed the documents for 45 minutes in the small meeting room while my parents sat outside. Then he came out and spoke to them quietly, and I watched through the glass partition as my mother put her hand over her mouth and my father sat with his hands flat on his knees, looking at the floor. Jeffrey came to find me. The transaction is clean, he said. I know. There may be a question of whether full disclosure was. Priya's number is on the last page, I said. She's happy to speak with you. He nodded slowly. He was too experienced to be visibly shocked, but I could see him recalibrating. This is going to be a difficult conversation for your family. I imagine so, I said. Claire called me that evening from Auckland. The call came through at 7:30, and I let it ring twice before I answered. Not because I was nervous, but because I wanted a moment to be steady. Is it true? She said. Yes. You own the business. Yes. There was a long pause. Claire wasn't stupid, whatever her relationship with the business had been. She was not a stupid person. And I could hear her processing. Did you do this because of the dinner? No, I said. I did this 14 months ago. The dinner was a coincidence of timing. A dramatic one, but a coincidence. Mom is devastated. I know. She says you've been planning this for years, that you were just waiting to humiliate them. I sat with that for a moment. It would have been easy to get angry. I chose not to. I set up a company to buy an asset that was being sold on the open market, I said. I used my own savings to do it. I ran the business that I then purchased. If the timing feels humiliating, I understand that. But the decision to sell, and the decision not to include me in anything, those weren't my decisions. Another silence. What happens now? She said. I keep running the business, I said. Nothing has to change operationally. The staff keep their jobs. The contracts continue. And us? And them? That's up to them, I said. She didn't call back that night. My father sent a text message at 9:43 that said only, "We need to meet properly." I replied that I was available Thursday morning. The Thursday meeting was at my parents' house, which was a deliberate choice on their part. Neutral ground had been the Otutahi Club, and that hadn't gone the way they'd planned. Home ground felt safer to them. Our mother had made coffee and laid out a plate of biscuits, as though this were a normal visit. And I found that detail oddly moving the persistence of domestic ritual in the face of complete disruption. Jeffrey was there, which surprised me slightly. Priya was not there because I had decided not to bring her. I wanted this conversation to be personal, not legal, and I was confident enough in the legal position that I didn't feel I needed cover. My father began by saying that he felt he had been deceived. I let him say it. He talked for several minutes about trust, about family, about the assumption that I would have come to him if I was unhappy, about how a conversation could have changed everything. When he finished, I said, "Could it have?" He looked at me. If I had come to you 12 months before the dinner and said, "Dad, I'd like to be considered as a successor for the business. I'd like some equity. I'd like my contribution to be recognized, formally," what would you have said? He didn't answer immediately. Because I did have a version of that conversation, I said. When I was 24, when I first came back to work full-time, and you said the business would sort itself out in time, that I should focus on doing good work and not worry about the structure. And I did focus on doing good work. For 2 years. And then you put the business on the market without telling me. We didn't think. No, I said, not unkindly. You didn't. Our mother said. You could have told us who the buyer was. The broker handled the sale, I said. Buyers aren't required to identify themselves. My legal team completed the transaction the same way any commercial buyer would. If anything had been improper, Jeffrey would have found it by now. Jeffrey, to his credit, said nothing. "What do you want?" our father said finally. Not hostile, genuinely asking. I had thought about this question for 14 months, honestly. Since the moment I had signed those documents and understood that I had moved from being a dependent in this story to being something else entirely. "I want to run a good business," I said. "I want the people who have worked for Holloway Grounds for 15 and 20 years to keep their jobs. I want to build on what you actually built, which is real and worth building on. I want to have a relationship with my family that isn't based on me accepting whatever I'm given and being grateful." My mother looked down at her coffee cup. "And I want you to understand," I said, more quietly, "that I didn't do this to punish you. I did it because I finally understood that waiting to be chosen wasn't a strategy, it was just waiting." The room was very still. My father looked at the table for a long time. Then he looked at me, and something in his face shifted not all the way. Not into understanding exactly, but into the beginning of it. "You're good at this," he said. "Running it." "I know," I said. Not arrogance. Just the truth, offered plainly. The way I had been offering it for 2 years to anyone who'd been paying attention. In the weeks that followed, the logistics settled. Priya and Jeffrey handled the formal documentation, confirming the ownership position and the management arrangements going forward. I brought in Diane, my business mentor, to facilitate a conversation about future governance, how my parents might remain connected to the business in an advisory capacity if they wanted to, how Claire might find a role if she ever genuinely wanted one, how to structure things so the business could grow without the family dynamics strangling it. My father came to that meeting. He asked careful questions. He didn't agree with everything I said, but he was there. And he was listening, which was more than I had sometimes believed he was capable of. Claire took longer. She and I had a genuine conversation about 3 months later, in Auckland, over coffee near her flat in Ponsonby. She admitted that she hadn't wanted the business, that the announcement at the dinner had surprised her as much as it had surprised me, and that she had felt trapped by it, by the expectation that she would now become something she had never wanted to be. "I didn't even know what a maintenance contract was," she said, with the particular self-deprecating humor she had always been better at than I gave her credit for. "I know," I said. "Were you angry? At me?" I thought about it properly before I answered. "Not at you," I said. "You didn't make those decisions. You just benefited from them. And then suddenly you were supposed to inherit the consequences." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "That's a very mature way to put it." "I've had a lot of time to think about it," I said. "We didn't become best friends overnight. That's not how any of this works in real life. And I think there's something dishonest in stories that suggest otherwise, that revelation creates instant repair, that the dramatic moment carries a healing power that smooths everything flat. It doesn't. What we had was a beginning. A more honest version of the relationship than the one we'd been pretending to have. Holloway Grounds is doing well. We rebranded slightly, kept the name, updated the visual identity, began building a stronger digital presence for the commercial contracts side. We won back one of the council contracts we'd lost the previous year, on merit and on price. I hired a new operations coordinator to take some of the day-to-day load so I could focus on the growth side. My father drove past a job site in Rolliston a few months ago, one of our new residential development contracts, native plantings, stormwater-sensitive design, the kind of work I had always wanted to be doing, and he called me afterwards. He didn't say a lot. He said, "That's a good job." I said, "Thank you." That was enough. Not everything needs a dramatic ending. Sometimes the resolution is just the work. Continuing. The business running, the plants going in, the soil doing what soil does when it's properly understood. I think the real lesson in all of this is something I've come back to many times since that Thursday morning in my parents' kitchen. The people who love you are not always the people who see you clearly. Your family can know your face and your history and the way you take your coffee, and still not see what you're actually capable of. That is not a reason to leave, or to be bitter, or to spend your life performing for an audience that has already decided who you are. It is, however, a reason to build your own position, quietly, carefully, with legal counsel you trust, and a business mentor who tells you the truth, and the kind of patience that looks from the outside like stillness, but is actually just long preparation. Don't wait to be chosen. Understand your own value well enough that the choosing becomes a formality. And if your family ever decides to give away something that already belongs to you, make sure you have the paperwork.